Man, oh man, I have suspected for a while that the Humble team has cheekily been designing their bundles around themes. After all, this whole operation kicked off during the monthly subscription box craze, and those things were a complete mystery to the subscriber until they arrived. They were also usually centered around a theme. Then it also seemed like a few of the games aligned with one another, like that time a few years back when there were 3 survival sandboxes in one bundle. It just makes sense, but never before has that idea been so apparent as in the May 2019 Humble Monthly Bundle. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my esteemed privilege to present to you the Humble Disappointment Bundle. That's right, whether it's the mild disappointment of simply not getting to play a cool-looking game because of a lack of community interest, or it's the more prevailing sense of cynicism welling up in the depths of your soul until it pervades every aspect of your life because yet another AAA publisher has attempted to shake your pockets completely empty by baking anti-consumer practices directly into their code and allowing you to pay for its removal at a real-world currency premium. Humble has got you 100% equipped to enjoy that fantasy. I have to say, given that context, they did a really good job. My only suggestion would have been to make the bundle fewer than 6 games, because the biggest source of disappointment is when you're promised 6 of something and then get fewer. Am I right, ladies? Somebody give me a Netflix special, we'll call it Schumer. I barely know her. All joking aside, this bundle really was mediocre. Its crown gem was Assassin's Creed Origins, an entry into a franchise that's been hitting Call of Duty levels of predictability, Sonic 06 levels of horseshit glitchery, and is apparently trying to upset EA's stranglehold on complete disregard for its customers' best interests. My guess is that is what inspired the name Origins. The gameplay was admittedly a refreshing departure from the formulaic patterns it'd been following. The story was interesting, new mechanics and gameplay loops were explored, and the exploration of their vivid environment really tickled that completionist itch. The one aspect that completely ruined any value all of that had was a simple one. Progression in terms of strength and viability was pursued through hours of hunting down wildlife and resources to craft better iterations of your gear. The kicker was that they also included an in-game microtransaction store bundle that gave you these resources for real-world currency, and to throw salt into that wound, while inadvertently drawing all deserved suspicion onto themselves, that section of the store was labeled Time Savers, which truly begs the question. In a world where developers design how players spend their time and for what reasons, why would they introduce mechanics they felt their customers would need to save themselves from? It's more or less an admission of intentionally wasting your time and thinking you're so stupid or so desperate to get your Assassin's Creed fix that you'd willingly shell out for it. Fuck 'em. Then we had Finding Paradise, which was honestly one of the furthest things from a disappointment that I could imagine. Unless, of course, dying from dehydration brought about by shedding one too many single manly tears in quick succession doesn't sound like a blisteringly fun experience. Another point of contention would be that it's not really a game so much that it is a very well told story, but even then the narrative mastery of this particular developer can more than compensate to negate that disappointment. It might not have loads of brain-tickling puzzles or guns to play with, but hey, your dad keeps his pistol in that safe under his dresser. I hear safe cracking is pretty puzzling, so that's pretty much a twofer. I just wouldn't recommend it under the influence of having played this game, or at all publicly. Long story short, the experience was great and entertaining, but tragic and bittersweet. It was definitely one of the more real and human entries into the bundle. Monster Prom was disappointing in that I heard a lot of good things about it, and then it just flat out sucked. The gameplay sucked, the writing sucked, the atmosphere sucked. Suck, suckity, suck, suck, suck. It puffs itself up by marketing itself as edgy and irreverent, but in the same breath goes out of its way to make sure that it's inclusive so that its audience is cozy and comfortable. It turns out that what they meant by their marketing was that it's so loud, obnoxious, and thirsty for attention and validation that you'd think a YouTuber produced it. The identity conflict gave it the same vibes as a person who tries desperately to look like they don't give a fuck about what you think, but in actuality, they really do. They're just offensive enough to make people with normal haircuts give an uncomfortable little cringe, but not so much so that they'd make the leather jacket wearing lesbian with one half of her head shaved bald and the other dyed a neon blue, round sunglasses, a beret, and funny feelings about gender feel out of place. I'm of course being a dumbass for effect, but the point is, if you're going to play the dark humor no filter game, you can't also grant special privileges to a demographic because it's kind of a filter. That's pulling punches. It feels like baby's first and last dead baby joke. It's its own punchline. The visual artist, however, did a fantastic job, and the character designs are great. At least you'll have something nice to look at while you question your spending habits. The Journey Down Chapter 3 was one of the stronger titles to be included, which is disappointing in its own right. For me, it's because I didn't play the first two titles, so I felt like I was missing out. Full disclosure, this is not a hint that I would like to see them both pop up in a future bundle. For others, this could have been because it was a point-and-click adventure game, which seems to me like it's a genre that draws a niche audience. Having an interesting but oddly stylized Afro-Caribbean vibe is probably going to turn at least a fraction of those guys off. Layer that in with the disappointment the rest of the bundle brings, and I'd wager a lot of people wouldn't even give it the time of day, which I assume would disappoint the developers at least a little bit, even if I'm sure they already got their cut regardless. The game is far from bad, but it fills that role of an interesting title you might never have tried, but will if the Humble crew has established themselves as the arbiters of taste they imply they are with a curated mystery bundle. Given that they definitely haven't this time around, that hurts this game's impact. It's got great characterization, humorous puzzles, and very entertaining writing, but it lacks the gravitas to carry the rest of the bundle on its shoulders. If you haven't tried it though, I recommend it. Then of course we have Wandersong, which is one hell of an adventure. The gameplay was creative and harmonized well with its adorable storybook aesthetic. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before in my life, and I wouldn't have considered it anything resembling a disappointment had it only refined its message to have any grounding in reality whatsoever. Unfortunately, it was too busy trying to metaphorically suck your spiritual dick by telling you what a special, special boy you are and teaching you to resolve all of your problems by being a submissive little bitch. Or at the very most, making an irritated face and whining about it. I don't know what I expected from a game that uses so many pastels, but it still managed to demolish my expectations. If you've trained yourself to ignore messages so you can actually enjoy literally anything in this day and age, it's fantastic and you'll enjoy it a lot. If, however, the feel-good propaganda of the times is boring a hole through your mind and leaving you in a state of nigh-permanent existential despondence, this puppy is definitely not going to change a single goddamn thing. Do Not Feed the Monkeys is one of the other few games in the bundle that could have potentially salvaged it if only it had the staying power to do so. It's a unique idea with a flawless execution. It's got dark themes conveyed through comedic writing and a veritable shitload of short narratives that could end in multiple different ways. I absolutely loved it from premise to completion, so there's no way in hell I would say it's a disappointment. Despite all of its positives, however, it has far too small of a scope to wield the responsibility of making the bundle a good one. In fact, my working hypothesis is that it wasn't meant to be a disappointment directly. Instead, it was meant to be fantastic as a contrast. It not only heightens the disappointment found in the other games, but also creates a sense of disappointment in its powerless relative to the very disappointment it contrasts. As a critic with the most exquisite of tastes, I have to give Humble the credit for this subtle inclusion. Very clever. Well played. Finally, we have I Am Not a Monster, which may not be a monster, but it is a tremendous disappointment, or at least it was at the time of the bundle's release up until the middle of October when the single-player campaign was actually released. The word's not out on that yet, though. All I know is that it was an exclusively multiplayer game with a dead community once the bundle released, and that was a year after the game was actually released. And then there was another 6 months before the single-player campaign came along to add value. The biggest disappointment came from the fact that the game had some great ideas going for it. The ingenuity mechanic was awesome. It had a lot of promise for strategy and devious manipulation, and it's a shame that it couldn't have been experienced in full. For those of you who have seen the previous Brags, God bless you, this would be the part where I do a breakdown of prices and score averages to derive the scores, but the results are in and feedback has determined that that's boring as fuck. Not to mention irrelevant for a lot of reasons. I already reviewed the games on their own merits, for example, so an average score doesn't add much to the conversation. An average doesn't even weight anything correctly. A couple of good games shouldn't drag an otherwise garbage bundle above the average line. Lately, the bundle scores have been feeling higher than I felt they deserved, but I figured that was just me pulling the punches in my scores. The best way to fix that is to just review the bundle the same way I review the games. Subjective estimations. After all, the quality of the elements in the painting and the way those elements are composed are two totally different topics entirely. In this case, the games are to the elements as the bundles are to the composition. The two should be held to two different standards. In this bundle, for instance, Ubisoft did some really shady shit, and I would hope that enough criticism would cause Humble to revisit their inclusion of games that practice similarly in the future. Would they even really care if I'm like, well, there was some minor little bullshit over there, but all in all, it's a pretty good bundle? Probably not. For me, that's shitty enough for me to raise a stink about. Does that impact the other games? Only in that Humble unintentionally fucked them over by putting them in a bundle beside them and the proximity makes them less attractive in the minds of the people consuming the bundles, but if you want to know what I think of them specifically, they've got a video for it. We all on the same page? Nah, well. So at the end of the day, the May 2019 bundle gets a 3.5 out of 10. In case I haven't been laying it on thickly enough, Ubisoft has pissed me off something fierce. One of the games was more or less entirely unplayable upon bundle release. Of the 5 that remained, one was a feel-good propaganda, the other was a video game equivalent of a soy boy playing Cards Against Humanity with an awkwardly shaped blue-haired feminist with a nose ring and an ill-fitting leather jacket. The 3 that were left after that were great, but all of them were more or less just visual stories that had varying degrees of interaction. It was ultimately extremely underwhelming. There was one final game, the humble original for the month, Once Upon a Crime in the West. Personally, I wouldn't say it added too much. It was a narrative murder mystery, which was cool, but I didn't care much for its introduction sequence, which used jarring audio and sequence jumps. Then the remainder of the game was instanced events that relied heavily on meandering storytelling and shaggy dog-like humor that legitimately made playing it feel like a chore. I didn't include these in the estimation of my score because they're meant to be experimental and no one really knows what to expect from them, so take that as you will. Finally, we arrive at the giveaway portion of the video. For the small price of reading the rules in the description below, you could be the, well, I wouldn't say proud owner of a key to one of the games of your choosing. All you have to do to reserve your entry is to tell me in the comments below what you think of Ubisoft's Time Savers section of the Assassin's Creed store. Am I blowing it out of proportion? I mean, I don't have to buy it, but its inclusion does raise the question of why anyone would feel the need to, right? Am I crazy or just a little unwell? Alright, now I truly can't tell, but I guess I'll wait a while and then I'll see. Until next time, remember that failure is not the worst case scenario. To go on with your bad selves and stay awesome.